I paid $75,000 for my son's wedding, dreaming of uniting two families. But 4 days before the celebration, I opened an envelope. Inside were just a few lines. "We don't want to see your family at this wedding." That's when I canceled everything. I remember the exact evening the idea first settled in my heart, like a candle being lit in a dark room. It was after supper, the kitchen still warm from the roast I'd made, and I was sitting at the old oak table with a cup of chamomile tea. My son had called earlier, his voice bubbling with excitement. "Mama," he said, "we've set the date." I could almost see the way his eyes must have lit up, the way his shoulders squared with that mixture of pride and nervousness young men carry when they're about to step into marriage. Now I've lived long enough to know that weddings aren't just about flowers and gowns and music. A wedding, when done with love, is a promise, not only between two people but between families. And that, honey, was where the trouble lay. You see, our family and hers had been feuding for years. I'm not talking about little spats, no. This was bitterness deep as tree roots. Their restaurant against ours, their inspectors against our peace, their pride against ours. My husband, God rest his soul, used to say the air grew thicker whenever we had to stand in the same room with them. And after he passed, I found myself holding the weight of that old quarrel in my hands. So when my son told me he was marrying that girl, oh, I didn't protest. I saw the way he looked at her, the softness in his voice when he said her name. That was love, pure and plain, and no mother worth her salt would stand in the way of that. But I also knew it meant we'd all have to face the fire again. That night at the table I asked myself, what if the wedding could be more than a party? What if it could be the bridge we've been needing all these years? The thought made my chest tighten with a strange mixture of fear and hope. I wanted more than a celebration of lace and champagne. I wanted peace. And that's when I decided I would pay for it all. $75,000. It wasn't a small thing, dear. It was years of savings, careful accounting, saying no to myself so many times when I wanted to say yes. But when I imagined my son's face as he stood at the altar, when I thought of the possibility that, maybe just maybe, both families could finally sit at one table without glaring across the plates, I knew it was worth it. Money comes and goes, but peace, that's priceless. The next morning I pulled out my ledger, the one my husband and I used to keep track of the restaurant's profits and our family's expenses. I sat there running my finger down the columns, calculating what I could move, what I could free. The numbers told me what I already knew. It would be tight, but it was possible. And once I saw that, there was no turning back. When I told my son, his voice cracked. "Mama, you can't do that. It's too much." But I just smiled into the receiver. "Son," I said, "you only get married once, God willing. Let me do this for you." He was quiet for a long while, then finally whispered, "Thank you." I could feel his gratitude through the phone line like a warm hand on my shoulder. As I began making the first calls, venues, florists, musicians, I felt a joy I hadn't felt since before my husband fell sick. It was as though I had found a new purpose, a new reason to pour my heart into something. Every detail became a thread in the tapestry I was weaving. The flowers that would line the aisle, the music that would fill the air, the food that would remind everyone of why we all fell in love with the restaurant business in the first place. But behind it all there was my deeper wish. That when his father's chair was left empty at that wedding, the air would not be filled with bitterness, but with love. That my son and his bride could begin their life without the heavy shadow of our feud stretching across them. I dreamed of the two families laughing together, clinking glasses, sharing bread. I dreamed of old wounds finally healing as we danced under the same roof. I told myself, this is how it ends. Not with another lawsuit, not with angry inspectors, but with music, with joy, with forgiveness. It was a grand dream, perhaps too grand for one old woman to carry alone. But dreams are funny things, sweetheart. Sometimes they're the only thing that keep us going when the world has turned hard. And so I paid. I signed the contracts, I wrote the checks, I watched as the bills piled up and the plans grew. Some people might call me foolish, but I called it love. Love for my son, love for the life he was building. And yes, even love for the hope that those who once tried to tear us down might one day sit beside us in peace. That was my dream of a wedding. Not just $75,000 worth of flowers and champagne, but $75,000 worth of hope. If I'm going to tell this whole story honestly, I have to go back to where the bitterness first began. You see, the trouble between our families didn't just appear when my son fell in love with that girl. No, it had roots, deep ones, stretching all the way into the years when both families were fighting for their place in the restaurant business. My husband and I built our restaurant from nothing but determination and calloused hands. I still remember the nights when he'd come home after midnight, his shirt damp with sweat, his fingers blistered from chopping and stirring all day. And me, I'd be up at dawn polishing silverware, testing recipes, answering calls. We built that place brick by brick, pot by pot, fueled by the belief that if you put love into food, people would taste it. But then there were them, the family who would later become our in-laws. They opened their place just a few streets away, around the same time we were finally finding our stride. First, we welcomed the competition. My husband even sent them flowers on their opening night. "There's room enough for everyone," he told me with that grin of his. But soon enough it became clear they didn't see it that way. They had connections we didn't. Political friends, cousins working in offices that made decisions about health codes, safety permits, fire inspections. And little by little, those connections became weapons. I'll never forget the first time an inspector showed up unannounced. It was a Tuesday evening right before the dinner rush. He walked in with a clipboard and a frown so deep you'd think we were running a rat's nest instead of a family restaurant. He checked the vents, the storage, the fire exits, every detail. My husband and I scrambled to keep up, but no matter what we showed him, he found fault. By the end of that week, we'd had 3 more surprise visits, all for different concerns. Fire safety one day, sanitation the next. It was like they were trying to bury us in paperwork and fines. And behind it all, though they never admitted it, we knew exactly who was pulling the strings. The bride's parents. My husband had a temper, and Lord, did it flare in those days. I can still see him slamming his fist down on our kitchen table, rattling the salt and pepper shakers. If they think they can drive us out, they've picked the wrong man to fight. His eyes would burn when he said it, and though I was frightened sometimes, I also knew he was right. We weren't about to let go of everything we had built. It went on for months, maybe years, truth be told. Inspections, whispers around town, their friends telling customers that our place was unsafe or unsanitary. We lost sleep, we lost money, but what we didn't lose was our grit. My husband hired a lawyer, gathered every scrap of evidence, and dragged the whole matter into court. The day of that trial is burned into my memory. I wore my best navy dress, the one with the pearl buttons, and sat right behind him as he gave his testimony. He spoke with a kind of fire that made even the judge lean forward. He laid out every inspection, every fine, every moment of harassment, until the truth was plain as day. And when the verdict came, when the court ruled in our favor and awarded us damages, I thought for just a heartbeat that it was finally over. But it wasn't. We walked out of that courthouse with our heads high, holding papers that said we had won. But the victory didn't cool anything. If anything, it poured oil on the fire. Their pride couldn't stand the loss, not in public, not in front of the whole town. From that day on, the feud was no longer about restaurants or inspectors. It was about something deeper. Humiliation, resentment, the kind of bitterness that doesn't fade with time. Even when we tried to keep to ourselves, even when we focused on our own business and family, it was there, humming beneath the surface like a wasp nest. The smallest encounters, passing each other at the market, bumping into them at church festivals, turned stiff and cold. Words that could have been polite were sharpened instead. as if every hello was a reminder of the trial. My husband, may God bless his soul, never forgave them. He could be charming with anyone else, but when it came to that family, his face hardened like stone. He used to mutter under his breath, "They'll pay for what they did, one way or another." And though I tried to soften his heart, I can't pretend I didn't carry my own hurt too. They had tried to ruin us, to take food off our table, to crush what we had worked so hard to build. How do you forgive that? Years passed, but the bitterness stayed. And then life, in its strange way, brought us back together. Not through business, not through courtrooms, but through love. My son, the very heartbeat of my life, fell in love with their daughter. When he told me, I felt my knees weaken. Not because I didn't think she was a sweet girl, she was, but because I knew what it meant. Our two families chained together whether we liked it or not. All the years of bitterness, all the scars left by lawsuits and whispered lies, would now be forced to sit at the same table, share the same photographs, smile for the same toasts. My husband was a man of few words when it came to strangers, but with me he never held back. He had a way of speaking that cut right through the air, sharp as a knife, leaving no room for doubt about what he meant. And when it came to the family of my son's bride, their restaurant, their schemes, their endless tricks, he never minced a syllable. I can still see him the day the court case ended. We had just returned home, the papers still in my purse, the weight of that judgment both lifting and pressing down on us. I set my handbag on the counter, took a deep breath and said, "It's over now. We can rest." But he just shook his head, his jaw clenched tight. He poured himself a glass of water, though the way his hand trembled as he held it made me think it might as well have been whiskey. He turned to me, eyes flashing the way they did when he was riled. "Listen to me," he said. "If I see that man again, if I so much as catch him breathing the same air as me, he won't be walking away with just a fine and a slap on the wrist. Do you understand?" I froze. He wasn't shouting, but the tone in his voice carried more danger than any raised voice ever could. It was low, steady, like a storm rolling in from far off, the kind that shakes the windows before the rain even falls. I set down the dish towel I was holding and whispered, "Don't talk like that." He slammed his glass on the counter so hard a crack formed at the base. "Don't tell me how to talk. They tried to ruin us. They sent those inspectors into our lives day after day, tried to shame us, to break us down. And when we beat them fair and square in court, they sneered like jackals. If I see him again, the court will be the least of his worries." That was my husband. Fierce, protective, loyal to the bone. He wasn't a cruel man. Oh no, he had a soft side that few ever saw. I knew it when he kissed the tops of our children's heads as they slept, when he brought me daisies from the roadside just because, when he stayed up late fixing broken chairs so we wouldn't have to spend a penny we didn't have. But that soft side was only for us. To the rest of the world, especially to those who threatened his family, he was iron. I won't lie, his words scared me that night. I remember lying awake beside him, listening to his breathing slow into sleep, while I stared at the ceiling wondering how long a heart could carry that much anger before it broke. I wanted to believe that once the dust settled he would soften, that time would heal his rage. But it didn't. Not really. Whenever their name came up, whether it was in the papers, on someone's lips in town, or whispered at a church supper, his whole body would stiffen. He'd mutter things under his breath, things that made me cross myself quietly when he wasn't looking. I knew better than to argue with him. That man would have walked through fire before letting anyone harm us again. And though part of me was grateful for his strength, another part longed for peace. After he passed, the house felt so quiet without his footsteps, without the weight of his presence. And in that silence I found myself reflecting on his words. His warning wasn't just about one man or one feud, it was about his way of living. Protect at all costs. Fight back no matter what. Never forgive an enemy. But I couldn't live that way, not after he was gone. His anger had kept us alive, yes, but it had also kept us bound. I didn't want to spend my remaining years chained to bitterness. I wanted to be the one to finally break the cycle. So, sweetheart, when I stood in that kitchen years later, dreaming of my son's wedding, I thought of him. I thought of his warning, his voice echoing in my ears. And I made a vow to myself. If he could not let go of the feud, then I would. For him, for me, and for our children. It wasn't easy. Lord knows, I felt that same anger stir inside me whenever I remembered the inspections, the lies, the humiliation. But I also remembered the way his temper weighed on him, how it wore him down. And I thought, I don't want my son to inherit that anger. I want him to inherit love. That's why I threw myself into the wedding preparations with such devotion. It wasn't just about flowers or menus, it was about proving to myself, and maybe even to him wherever his soul was, that I could choose differently. I could build a bridge instead of another wall. Still, his words never left me. Sometimes, late at night, when I was folding linens for the reception or making lists of guests, I would hear his voice in the back of my mind. The court will be the least of their worries. And I'd pause, wondering what he would think if he saw me now, spending $75,000 to unite with the very people he swore he'd never forgive. Would he be angry with me? Would he shake his head and say I was wasting my time, my money, my heart? Or would he deep down understand what I was trying to do? I like to believe he would. Because for all his fire, for all his threats, my husband loved our family more than life itself. And if he could see that my dream was to give our son a fresh start, free from courtrooms, free from inspections, free from bitterness, I think maybe he'd rest a little easier. So I carried his warning with me, not as a burden, but as a reminder. A reminder of what anger can do if you let it take root, and of why I needed to try another way. And so, as the wedding drew nearer, I poured myself into the work with a kind of determination I hadn't felt since my younger years. I vowed that this would not end in threats and warnings, but in peace. At least that was my hope. Once the decision was made, once I promised myself that I would pay for this wedding and that I would see it through, there was no holding me back. I may have been gray-haired and a little slower on my feet than I used to be, but I was determined to make this the kind of celebration that would be remembered for a lifetime. Not just remembered for beauty, but for healing. I woke early most mornings, sometimes before the sun, with lists running through my mind. Flowers, invitations, music, seating charts. Endless details, all of them needing careful attention. I'd sit at the kitchen table with my notebook open, a cup of coffee beside me, and the faint tick of the old wall clock keeping me company. I felt like a general preparing for battle, though my battlefield was filled with roses and ribbons instead of swords. The first thing I did was secure the venue. Oh, it was a fine one, sweetheart. A grand hall with tall windows that looked out over a garden, where the sunlight could pour in like a blessing. When I first stepped inside, I felt the hush of the place and imagined my son standing there at the altar, waiting for his bride. I could almost hear the music swelling, almost see the guests rising to their feet. That image alone was worth every penny of the deposit I signed over. Then came the flowers. Now, I've always believed that flowers carry their own language. They whisper things words can't quite say. So I made sure we had white roses for purity, lilies for devotion, and soft sprays of baby's breath to symbolize everlasting love. I worked with the florist as though I were painting a picture, each bloom a brushstroke in a masterpiece of peace and beauty. The food, oh, I gave special attention there. After all, both our families had restaurants, and food had been the very thing that divided us. So I wanted it to be the thing that brought us together. I chose a menu that honored both sides. Our recipes, their recipes, dishes that had been fought over in the past now sharing the same table. There would be roast chicken with lemon and herbs, a nod to my husband's favorite dish, and their family's specialty seafood stew, balanced by fresh breads, roasted vegetables, and cakes that seemed too beautiful to eat. The music was another matter I took to heart. I wanted melodies that could soften even the hardest memory. I met with the quartet myself, insisting on pieces that would stir joy but also dignity. Beethoven for the ceremony, light jazz for the dinner, and a good strong dance band for when the evening wore on and hearts loosened. Every time I signed a check, every time I made a choice, I felt like I was stitching together a quilt of reconciliation. Each detail was a patch, a piece of fabric sewn not just for beauty but for meaning. I kept telling myself, if I can make this day beautiful enough, maybe it will soften their hearts. Maybe it will show them that there's more to life than grudges and court cases. And oh, the joy it gave me, sweetheart, seeing it all come together. I'd walk through the florist's cool workshop, inhaling the scent of roses and peonies, and my heart would swell. Or I'd taste a sample from the caterer, the flavors bursting across my tongue, and I'd picture the smiles around the tables. Even the music rehearsals made me misty-eyed. I'd stand in the corner of the hall, listening as the notes floated through the air, imagining the moment my son would take his bride's hand for their first dance. There were nights I lay in bed, too excited to sleep, my mind still buzzing with details. I'd picture the tables dressed in linen, the centerpieces glowing under candlelight, the laughter and clinking of glasses, the mingling of voices once sharp with anger now softened by joy. I believed in it with every ounce of my being. That this wedding would be the end of bitterness, that it would be a new beginning. Sometimes I'd even talk to my husband, as though he were still there beside me. Can you see it, love? I'd whisper into the quiet. Do you see how our son will stand proud? Do you see how the families will finally eat at the same table? I imagined him smiling, maybe shaking his head at how much I was spending, but still proud. Proud of me for trying, proud of our boy for choosing love. I won't pretend it was easy. There were moments when my body ached from running here and there, when the bills stacked up and made my stomach twist, when doubt crept in and whispered, what if it all fails? But I brushed those thoughts aside. I had lived long enough to know that if you want peace, you have to fight for it just as hard as you fight a battle. And I was willing to fight, even if my weapons were roses and music sheets instead of gavel and law. The closer the day came, the more certain I felt. I'd walk into that venue and see the light slanting through the tall windows, and I'd think, yes, this will be the place where it ends, the fighting, the bitterness, the old wounds. This is where it will all turn into love. And for a time I let myself believe it was already happening. That all my lists, all my sacrifices, all my determination would finally pay off. That love could do what money and courts could not. I carried that hope like a lantern in the dark. And oh, how bright it shone. It was 4 days before the wedding when it came. I remember the morning clearly, one of those golden August days when the air feels almost gentle, carrying the promise of celebration. I was at the kitchen table again, my notebook of wedding lists open beside a cup of tea, when the postman knocked. He left a small stack of envelopes, nothing unusual, bills, advertisements, a card from an old friend. But there, in the middle, was an envelope with no return address. I opened it without a thought, humming to myself as I tore the seal. But the words inside stopped my breath cold. It was short, just a few lines typed, no signature. Cold as stone. We don't want your family at the wedding. It will be better for everyone if you stay away. My hand shook so badly I nearly spilled my tea across the page. I read it once, then twice, then a third time, hoping I had misunderstood. But the words didn't change. They sat there on the paper, plain and brutal, like a knife driven straight into my chest. I pressed the letter flat against the table, staring at it while my heart pounded in my ears. My first thought was, this has to be a mistake. A cruel prank. Something not meant for me. But then my son's voice echoed in my mind. A week earlier, he had sounded distant when I asked about the final seating chart. He had said, "Mama, maybe it would be simpler if..." And then he trailed off. I had brushed it aside at the time, thinking he was just tired. But now with this letter in my hands, the thought twisted inside me. Did my own son agree to this? The room blurred. I clutched the table just to steady myself. The very wedding I had poured my soul and my savings into, the wedding I had built like a bridge of hope, had no place for me. I sat there for hours, the letter spread out before me like a wound. First I felt disbelief, then sorrow, and then slowly the sorrow boiled into anger. I thought of the $75,000 I had signed away, the endless hours I had spent chasing down florists and caterers, the way I had stitched every detail together with my bare hands. I thought of the sleepless nights, the aching bones, the prayers whispered into the dark. All of it dismissed, cast aside like I was an embarrassment, an unwanted guest. My anger shook me more than the sadness did, because sadness says you weren't enough, but anger says how dare they? And in that moment I was blazing with it. How dare they erase me? How dare they cut out not only me but my whole family? My son's brothers, his cousins, the ones who had carried him when he was small, who had cheered for him at every step. We were not strangers. We were his blood. I folded the letter carefully, almost too carefully, and tucked it back into its envelope. My hands were steady now. My decision was forming even as my heart broke. I whispered aloud, though no one was there to hear me. If I am not welcome, then neither is my money. I thought back to my husband, to the warning he had given all those years ago, that if they crossed him again, the court would be the least of their worries. He was gone, but his fire lived on in me. And though I wasn't a woman of fists or threats, I had my own way of fighting. They had taken my dream of reconciliation and stomped it into the dirt. They had turned my sacrifice into a mockery. But I still had one card to play. That evening, as the sun set behind the curtains, I sat down with the folder of contracts. One by one I pulled them out: venue, caterer, florist, musicians, rentals. My name was on every line. My money was in every account. I read them again, not as a mother, but as a businesswoman. And I realized I still had control. The pain was still there, of course, like a stone pressing against my ribs. But now it was covered by a new resolve. If they didn't want me, they didn't want what I gave. That night I didn't sleep. I lay awake in the dark, the letter beside me on the nightstand, my thoughts racing. I wondered if my son had known, if he had stood silently by while his bride's family sharpened their cruelty. I wondered how he could bear to let me be cast aside. That thought cut deeper than the letter itself. And yet, beneath all the hurt, I felt a strange calm. I had always believed that mothers exist to give, to build, to sacrifice. But I realized then that there are limits, that sometimes love means not letting yourself be trampled. By morning I was ready. The letter had broken me, yes, but from the pieces I was about to build my answer. The morning after that dreadful letter, I rose before the sun. My body ached from a night of tossing and turning, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. I stood at the kitchen counter, letter in hand, and whispered to myself, so be it. I had poured $75,000 into that wedding. Every deposit slip, every signed contract, every bill had my name on it. And if my family wasn't welcome, then neither was my money. I started with the venue. My voice shook when I dialed the number. Not from fear but from the storm still raging inside me. When the coordinator answered cheerfully, asking if I was calling with final details, I took a breath and said, "Cancel it. Cancel everything." There was silence on the other end. Then a flustered stammer. "Mrs. H, the wedding is in just 4 days. Everything is prepared." "Yes," I said calmly. "And you'll return my deposit as stated in the contract. Send me the paperwork." I could almost hear her blinking in disbelief. I didn't wait for her protests. I hung up and moved on. The caterer was next. They had already ordered most of the ingredients for the feast I'd chosen. Roast chicken, seafood stew. The whole spread meant to unite two families. When I told them to cancel, the man tried to bargain. We can adjust the menu, Mrs. H. We can. No, I said firmly. Cancel. I'll take the penalty if I must. But there will be no wedding here. By the time I reached the florist, the anger in me had settled into a cold determination. I could hear the florist's assistant rifling through papers when I gave my name. Oh yes, the roses and lilies are arriving tomorrow. We'll be arranging them on Friday. Cancel it, I interrupted. Send the bill for what's already done. But there will be no wedding flowers. Her breath caught. But the bride's mother said everything was settled. That my blood ran hot. The bride's mother. Of course. I didn't need proof to know where that letter had come from. The tone, the cruelty, it was her hand all over. I canceled the string quartet, the rentals, the bakery. One after another, I withdrew the very foundation of that wedding. And each time I felt a small piece of my dignity return. They had thought me powerless, thought they could take my money and erase me in the same stroke. They had forgotten whose name signed the checks. By noon the phone was ringing off the hook. Some calls were from vendors desperate to confirm. Others I knew were from my son and his bride. I didn't answer. Not yet. I couldn't bear to hear his voice, not while the pain was still raw. Instead, I sat down at the table, spread the contracts before me like cards in a game, and made sure every cancellation was confirmed in writing. I wrote notes in the margins, my hand steady. Not welcome, not paying. They chose this. The house grew quiet once the calls stopped. I poured myself a cup of tea, though it went cold untouched. For the first time in weeks I felt no rush of lists, no weight of plans. Only silence. It was a heavy silence, yes, but it was mine. I won't lie to you, sweetheart. Part of me ached as I imagined the shockwaves spreading. The hall standing empty. The florist, left with piles of unused blooms. The caterer with trays of food never served. And most of all, my son, standing bewildered in the wreckage of what was supposed to be his day. But another part of me said firmly, they must see. They must understand what it means to cast us aside. By evening the calls started again. This time messages filled the answering machine. My son's voice urgent, almost pleading. Mom, what happened? Why did you do this? Call me back. His bride, her voice sharp and cold. You've ruined everything. How could you? I listened silent, my hands folded in my lap. When the machine clicked off, the house fell quiet again. But my heart pounded with a strange mixture of sorrow and strength. I thought of my husband then. His warnings, his fire, his refusal to bow to those people. In my own way I had carried his spirit that day. Not through fists or threats, but by standing my ground. For years we had been at the mercy of their schemes, their political connections, their inspectors knocking at our door. And now, when I had tried to build peace, they had spat on the effort. Well, no more. If they thought they could have my money and my silence, they were sorely mistaken. That night I slept better than I expected. My dreams were troubled, yes, visions of empty tables, of music never played. But beneath it all was a steady calm. I had taken back my voice. Of course I knew the storm wasn't over. The calls, the questions, the confrontations, they were all still coming. But in that moment, as I drifted into sleep, I told myself this. Better to lose a wedding than to lose one's dignity. The knock came 2 evenings later. I knew it would, though I'd half hoped for more time. I was in the kitchen, folding a stack of linens I had intended for the reception tables, when the sound rattled through the house. Firm. Urgent. Not the polite tap of a neighbor or the gentle knock of a friend. No, this was the knock of a son who wanted answers. I stood there for a moment, my hands resting on the soft cotton. My heart thudded against my ribs. For a fleeting second I thought of ignoring it. Let them pound on the door until their hands grew sore. But a mother doesn't run from her children, even when her children have wounded her. So I smoothed my apron, lifted my chin, and opened the door. There they stood. My son, his shoulders stiff, his jaw tight, and beside him his bride, eyes blazing, lips pressed thin. They looked like two people carrying a storm with them, and my quiet little doorway was the place they chose to unleash it. "Mom," my son said, his voice clipped. "We need to talk." I stepped aside without a word, motioning them in. The air inside the house felt heavier the moment they crossed the threshold. My son glanced around the room, perhaps noticing the silence, the absence of the usual warmth. His bride stayed close to him, her gaze darting around like a hawk searching for prey. We sat at the table, the very table where I had dreamed and planned and scribbled notes for their wedding. Now it felt like a battlefield. My son leaned forward, his hands clasped tight together. "Why?" he asked finally. His voice cracked, not with tenderness, but with a mix of anger and confusion. "Why would you do this? You canceled everything. Do you realize what you've done?" I met his eyes, steady though my hands trembled in my lap. "I realize," I said softly. His bride let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. "You've ruined it. For days before the wedding, do you know what people are saying? Do you know the mess you've caused?" Her words stung, but I didn't let it show. I turned my gaze back to my son. "You want to know why? Here." I rose, walked to the sideboard, and picked up the envelope, the letter that had broken me. I placed it on the table between us. "Read." He frowned, his hands hesitant as he pulled out the folded paper. His bride leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. As his eyes moved across the words, I saw the shift happen. The confusion melted into shock. His face drained of color. What is this?" "You tell me," I said, my voice low but firm. His bride snatched the paper from his hands, scanning it quickly. Her face flushed, but not with surprise. No, hers was the look of someone caught, someone scrambling to mask the truth. She slammed the paper back onto the table. "This doesn't mean anything. Could be fake. Could be from anyone." But my son wasn't convinced. He stared at me, then back at the letter, and I could see the dawning realization in his eyes. "It wasn't you," he whispered, almost to himself. "It wasn't you who wanted to back out. It was them." I nodded once. "Her parents," I said plainly. "They sent it. They wanted to erase us just as they tried to ruin us years ago. And you?" My voice trembled despite me. "You let me believe you agreed." He sank back in his chair, his face buried in his hands. For a long while, the only sound in the room was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. His bride sat stiffly, her lips pressed shut, her eyes flashing with anger, but she said nothing. Finally, he lifted his head, his eyes red. "Mom, I didn't know. I thought maybe you just stepped aside, that it was what you wanted." I shook my head. "What I wanted, son, was peace. I wanted both families to come together. I wanted love to win. But they couldn't bear it. They couldn't stand to share the table. And instead of telling me the truth, you let me carry the weight of thinking you'd chosen them over us." His face twisted with pain. He reached for my hand, but I pulled it back, not out of cruelty, but because the wound was still too fresh. "I canceled everything because they made it clear we weren't wanted," I continued. "And if we aren't wanted, neither is my money, neither is my effort. They took my dream and spit on it. I will not bankroll their pride." Silence fell again. My son's bride shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting toward the door as though she wished to flee. But my son stayed, his gaze fixed on me, a new heaviness settling in his expression. "Then we'll do it without them," he said finally, his voice firm, almost defiant. "We'll still marry. But it won't be their way. It won't be their money. And it sure as hell won't be with them dictating who belongs." My breath caught. For the first time in days, I felt something soften in my chest. My boy, my stubborn, proud boy, was finally seeing the truth. The bride let out a faint protest, But he silenced her with a look. He reached across the table again, and this time I let him take my hand. His grip was warm, strong, full of something I hadn't felt from him in too long: loyalty. In that moment I knew the tide had turned. The confrontation I had dreaded had become the beginning of something new. They had tried to cut us out, but instead they had cut themselves off. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and golden, the kind of day that feels like a blessing. I woke before the rooster crowed, too full of nerves and joy to sleep any longer. The air carried that sweet summer smell, fresh-cut grass and a hint of wildflowers, and I told myself it was a sign. A new beginning, clear and warm. We gathered at the little white church just after sunrise. Its walls were plain, its windows simple, but when the sun poured through the stained glass, the whole place seemed to glow. My son stood at the front, fidgeting with his tie, looking both terrified and radiant. I watched him and thought of the boy who once scraped his knees playing in our yard, who used to reach for my hand when he was frightened. Now here he was, a man about to begin his own family. The bride arrived not long after, her dress simple but lovely, sewn with care by her aunt. There were no jeweled tiaras or silk trains this time, just lace that caught the light and a smile that softened her whole face. When she stepped through those church doors, I swear every head turned, every heart caught in its chest. Even mine. For all the hurt between our families, I couldn't deny her beauty, or the love in her eyes when she looked at my son. The ceremony itself was short, humble, but filled with so much love it seemed to overflow. The minister spoke of patience, of forgiveness, of building a home on faith and loyalty. My son's voice trembled when he said his vows, and her hand shook as she slid the ring onto his finger. When they kissed, the whole room burst into applause. My heart swelled until I thought it might burst too. Then came the reception in our backyard. Oh, sweetheart, you should have seen it. Strings of lanterns hung from the trees, swaying in the warm breeze. Tables were covered in white cloths, mason jars filled with garden flowers at the center. The smell of roasted chicken, casseroles, and fresh bread filled the air, making the whole place feel like home. Children ran barefoot in the grass, their laughter mixing with the fiddle and guitar. People ate, drank, danced. Laughter rolled across the yard like music. I stood near the porch, taking it all in, my heart lighter than it had been in years. For once, the feud didn't matter. The bitterness, the court cases, the years of cold shoulders, all of it seemed small compared to the sight of two families, or at least most of us, finally sharing a table in peace. And then they came. I saw them before anyone else. Standing at the edge of the yard, dressed in their Sunday best, her parents. The very ones who had written that letter, who had tried to erase us, who had spent years turning every screw they could find against our family. My breath caught in my chest. Conversation stilled as people began to notice them. The fiddle drew to a halt, the bow hanging mid-air. Even the children quieted, sensing the tension that swept like a shadow across the lawn. Her father took a step forward, his wife just behind him. For a long moment no one spoke. I could feel the heat of my husband's old warning in my memory. If I see him again, the court will be the least of his worries. And though my husband was gone, the echo of those words rang in my ears. My son froze, his arm around his bride. He looked at them, then at me, torn between duty and the hurt he now knew. His bride's hand tightened around his, her face pale but resolute. Finally, her father cleared his throat. His voice wasn't sharp this time, not dripping with pride or venom. It was low, almost hesitant. We came to apologize. You could have heard a pin drop. For years they had carried themselves with arrogance, untouchable with their political friends and their constant scheming. But now, standing at the edge of my yard, they looked smaller somehow. Her mother's eyes were wet, her voice trembling. We were wrong. About everything. About the inspections, about the court, about the wedding. We let our pride, our bitterness blind us. And we hurt all of you. She looked at me then, directly at me, And for the first time in decades, her expression wasn't hard, it was human. My chest ached. Part of me wanted to turn away, to protect myself, to cling to the anger that had kept me strong. But another part of me, perhaps the better part, saw the weight in their faces, the exhaustion of carrying hate for so long. I didn't answer right away. My son stepped forward, his voice steady. If you want to be here, it won't be on your terms. It won't be about politics or pride. It will be because you accept us as family. All of us. Including my mother. His words struck me deep. The boy I had raised had grown into a man who could stand his ground, who could speak truth without fear. Her father nodded slowly, almost humbled. We understand. And so, hesitantly, they stepped into the yard. For a moment, the tension hung heavy, as though the whole world was holding its breath. Then one of the children, too young to understand feuds, darted past them chasing a ball, and the spell broke. Laughter returned, the fiddle struck up again, and the celebration resumed. It wasn't easy, not at first. Their presence was like a stone in the shoe, uncomfortable, awkward. But as the evening wore on, something remarkable happened. I saw them laugh, genuinely laugh, at a story told across the table. I saw her mother dance with one of my nieces. I even saw her father raise a glass in my direction, a silent gesture of truce. As lanterns glowed and stars began to appear, I stood on the porch watching. My heart was cautious, scarred by years of fighting, but also hopeful. Maybe, just maybe, this wedding had done what I dreamed. The uninvited had arrived. But instead of ruining the day, they had opened a door I never thought I'd see. That evening, as the lanterns flickered in the trees and the music drifted into the warm night air, I found myself sitting quietly on the porch, watching it all unfold. The tables were still full, laughter rising and falling like a song, children darting about with sticky fingers from too much cake. And there, in the very center of it all, sat two families who had spent years clawing at one another, now eating from the same platters, drinking from the same pitchers, as though the past had been nothing but a bad dream. I almost didn't trust my eyes. For so long, I had lived with the bitterness, the constant tug-of-war that drained every ounce of peace from our lives. To see her parents there, smiling, not sneering, listening, not scheming, was something I thought I'd never witness. My son noticed me on the porch and came over. His bride's hand nestled in his. He crouched down beside me, his face soft in the glow of the lanterns. "Mama," he said quietly, "I don't know how to thank you." I looked at him, my boy who was no longer a boy, and felt tears sting my eyes. "You don't have to thank me," I whispered. "Just love her. Just build something better than what we all had before." He nodded, his jaw tightening with emotion, and for a moment we sat there in silence, watching the crowd. His bride turned to me then, her voice low but steady. "I was afraid at first. Afraid of what would happen without them. Afraid of how small everything felt. But this," she gestured to the glowing yard, the laughter, the dancing. "This is better. It feels real." I smiled at her then, for perhaps the first time without any shadow of doubt. "It is real, sweetheart. Because it's built on love, not pride." Later that night, her parents approached me. I'll admit, my body tensed as they drew near, old reflexes rising to the surface. But their faces were softer now, their eyes weary but genuine. Her father spoke first. "We've done you wrong," he said, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it. "We let our pride and our politics poison everything. We tried to destroy your family, and when that failed, we tried to erase you from this wedding. It was cruel. It was wrong." Her mother's eyes glistened as she added, "We were ashamed to lose in court, and instead of letting it go, we clung to our anger. Tonight, I saw what we almost ruined, and I am sorry, truly sorry." I studied their faces, searching for any trace of deceit. But what I saw instead was two people as tired of the fight as I was, two people who had finally laid down their weapons. For a long moment I said nothing. The years of pain pressed against me. The inspections, the court battles, the letter that had broken my heart. Forgiveness doesn't come easy when wounds run deep. But then I looked past them, at my son and his bride dancing under the lanterns, their faces lit with joy. I thought of my husband, and how he had carried his anger to his grave, heavy and unyielding. I thought of the vow I had made to live differently. And so I took a deep breath and said, "Then let us stop fighting. For their sake and for ours. Let's choose peace instead of pride." Her mother's lips trembled as she whispered, "Thank you." It wasn't a grand gesture, not a sudden erasing of the past, but it was a start. And sometimes a start is all you need. As the night wore on, the two families mingled more easily. There were still hesitations, of course. Old scars don't vanish overnight, but laughter bridged the gaps, and the music carried us forward. When her father joined a dance, clapping along with the fiddle, even I couldn't help but smile. By the time the last lantern flickered out and the guests began to leave, I felt something inside me ease. The anger I had carried, the disappointment, the bitterness, all of it seemed to loosen like a knot finally untangling. Standing in the quiet yard after everyone had gone, I whispered to the night, "We did it, love." I thought of my husband then, and though I knew he would have struggled to forgive, I prayed he could see the peace we had finally found. The families had reconciled, not perfectly, not without scars, but enough. Enough to allow my son and his bride to begin their life together without the shadow of our feud hanging over them. And that, in the end, was all I had ever wanted.